My sister texted at exactly 8. Wire the 2.5 million or don't bother showing up. Attached was a photo of my 17-year-old niece in a heavy engagement gown, standing next to a 60-year-old tycoon. She looked absolutely terrified. 10 minutes later, my father's voice note chimed in. "Don't ruin this family." I stood in the freezing alleyway outside the penthouse, quietly tracing the cold metal of my federal investigator badge hidden inside my coat pocket. I didn't panic. I just smiled. Because by midnight, they would all be in handcuffs. Have you ever been blamed for ruining a toxic family? Drop your city and the time you're listening below. The glowing numbers on my watch read exactly 8:30 in the evening. The deadline for their transaction was 11:59. I had 3.5 hours to let them walk perfectly into a federal trap. Instead of marching through the grand front entrance with its gold-plated revolving doors and uniformed doormen, I walked around the block to the service alley. It was damp and smelled faintly of bleach and old rain. I knew this alley intimately. 7 years ago, I used to stand right here, shivering in a cheap coat, waiting to take the pampered poodles of these exact penthouse residents out for their evening walks. Back then, I was invisible, a girl who cleaned up after the rich just to afford law school textbooks. Now, I was the one holding the leash. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opening the secure server application. The screen glowed with the green seal of the Department of Justice. The wiretap authorization, signed by a federal judge 48 hours ago, sat actively in my inbox. I tapped the screen, verifying that the audio feeds from inside the ballroom were stable. They were. I could hear the faint, ambient sound of a string quartet playing a classical arrangement. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses. And I could hear Leona's voice, sharp and commanding, directing the catering staff to keep the vintage champagne flowing. I leaned against the cold brick wall of the alley. It was strange how cyclical life could be. The people inside that ballroom believed they were utterly untouchable. They believed money and status insulated them from consequence. They had spent my entire life teaching me that I was less than them. Leona had always been the golden child, the one destined to marry well and maintain the illusion of high society. I was the anomaly, the stubborn girl who asked too many uncomfortable questions. But the universe has a very meticulous accounting system. I closed my eyes and let the freezing New York air fill my lungs. I was 25 years old, holding a forensic accounting degree and a badge that granted me access to the darkest financial corners of the country. I didn't come here tonight to throw a tantrum. I didn't come here to scream or demand apologies. Apologies are just feelings, and feelings cannot be admitted as evidence in a court of law. I came here for paper. I came here for the digital footprints. The alley door clicked open, an oblivious kitchen worker stepping out for a quick smoke break. He didn't notice me standing in the shadows. I watched him, thinking about the 17-year-old girl upstairs. Lily, my niece. She was trapped in a room full of predators wearing designer suits. They thought they had cornered her. They thought the $2.5 million debt was an inescapable cage. They were entirely wrong. I adjusted the lapels of my blazer and stepped out of the shadows. It was time to go to work. The trap was perfectly set. Forensic accounting is not a glamorous profession. It is a quiet, solitary discipline. We do not chase fugitives down dark alleys or kick in doors with weapons drawn. We hunt in the silence of spreadsheets. We look for the missing decimal, the offshore shell company, the signature that does not exactly match the date. People lie. Relatives lie to your face, but numbers possess an absolute, unyielding integrity. They never change their story to protect someone's fragile reputation. Marcus Thorne understood numbers, but he arrogantly believed he could manipulate them forever. He was a real estate magnate who built his empire on the quiet suffering of desperate people. Marcus did not break legs. He broke bank accounts. He laundered illicit funds through luxury developments and high society charity galas. He operated seamlessly in the gray space between legitimate wealth and absolute fraud. When Leona and Arthur, the man I used to call father, found themselves drowning in debt to maintain their ridiculous country club facade, Marcus was right there. He offered a lifeline, $2.5 million. It sounded like salvation, but it was a carefully constructed snare. The debt was never meant to be repaid. It was designed to balloon, to compound with hidden fees until it became a crushing weight. I stood in the service elevator, listening to the steady hum of the steel cables. My family had not stumbled into his trap by accident. They were carefully selected. Marcus had a specific appetite for families with a certain pedigree and a complete lack of morals. When the debt became insurmountable, he offered a solution, a trade. Lily. They were packaging a teenager into a fraudulent trust agreement under the thin guise of a debutante engagement. It was a sterile transaction, flesh and blood exchanged for zero balances. As the elevator climbed toward the penthouse, I mentally reviewed the federal statutes. Coercion, extortion, wire fraud. The charges were stacking up beautifully in my mind. Leona thought she was a master manipulator. She thought she had outsmarted the world by sacrificing her own daughter. She failed to realize that every time she signed a document, every time she moved money through those shadow accounts, she was simply handing me the ammunition I needed. I didn't need to argue with her or beg for her humanity. I just needed to let her sign her own confession on federal audio. The elevator chimed its arrival. 8 months ago. This was just another routine federal assignment. I was sitting at my desk at the Department of Justice, surrounded by stacks of banking records and half-empty coffee cups. My unit had been tracking a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. They were sophisticated, layered deep behind corporate veils, all tracing back to the Thorne Empire. We knew he was cleaning dirty money, but he was incredibly careful. He never left his own fingerprints on the transfers. I was running a standard cross-reference on a newly discovered subsidiary when the algorithm flagged a definitive match. I stared at the glowing monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The name on the screen did not belong to an anonymous corporate entity. It was an individual, Leona, my sister. Beneath her name were two others, Arthur and Evelyn, the people who raised me, the people who threw me out. I remember the profound stillness that settled over me in that cubicle. The air felt incredibly thin. For a fraction of a second, the trained investigator vanished, replaced by the ghost of a terrified teenager. But it only lasted a second. I leaned closer to the screen, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I pulled the transaction logs, the routing numbers, the authorization dates. It was a textbook laundering operation. Marcus was using my family's desperate need for social validation to move capital. He fed them loans, and they willingly acted as his financial mules, filtering the money through fake charity galas and luxury acquisitions. They were accomplices, willing, greedy, pathetic accomplices. The federal case had suddenly mutated into a deeply personal autopsy. I watched the numbers flow across the screen, tracking the timeline of their debt. I saw the exact moment the loans stopped being about real estate and started being about leverage. I saw the transfer of the trust framework. I saw Lily's name initially appear in the legal drafts. They were not just hiding money anymore. They were trading a human life to keep their country club memberships and their designer wardrobes. I didn't feel anger. Anger is loud and messy. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. I picked up my phone and formally filed a conflict of interest disclosure with my director. I laid out the connection. I stepped back from the lead position, allowing an independent task force to take the reins. I would not let them use our biology as a defense in court. I would be the consultant, the silent architect of their absolute downfall. The investigation became deeply personal. To understand how easily they could trade Lily, you have to understand the winter I turned 18. It was 7 years ago. The city was paralyzed by a brutal January blizzard. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Arthur and Evelyn sat me down. They did not look apologetic. They looked entirely annoyed by the inconvenience of my presence. They coldly informed me that the family was bankrupt. The college fund that my grandfather had supposedly set up for me was gone, evaporated in a bad market, they claimed. They told me I had until the end of the week to pack my things. They could no longer afford to carry dead weight. Leona stood in the doorway, sipping a warm latte, offering absolutely no defense. I packed 2 suitcases and left. I didn't beg. To pay for my undergraduate degree and eventually law school. I took the only job I could find that fit around my classes. I became a premium dog walker for the obscenely wealthy residents of the Upper East Side. Every morning at 5, I would freeze in the biting wind, managing 5 heavy leashes at once, cleaning up waste on the pristine sidewalks of Park Avenue. One particularly bitter Tuesday, my boots were soaked through with freezing slush. I was struggling to control a massive mastiff near the entrance of a luxury high-rise. I looked up and saw the revolving doors spin. Leona walked out. She was wearing a pristine camel hair coat, a brand new designer bag resting gracefully on her forearm. She was laughing, stepping into a waiting black town car. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. She saw me holding the leashes. She saw the snow in my hair. And then she looked right through me, turning her head as the driver closed her door. That was the moment the last thread of family loyalty snapped. They were not bankrupt. The coat, the bag, the car, they were funded by something else. I realized then that my college fund hadn't vanished in a recession. It had been sacrificed at the altar of their vanity. They had thrown me into the snow so they could keep wearing silk. I promised myself that day that I would never rely on anyone else's mercy. I would build my own fortress, brick by quiet brick. I would master the language of money, the very thing they worshipped, and I would use it to understand exactly what they had done. I learned to stop feeling. For 7 years, I kept a single piece of paper in a locked drawer of my desk. It was a letter, supposedly written and signed by my late grandfather just weeks before he passed away. The ink was faded, but the words were permanently burned into my memory. It stated that I was a fundamental disappointment to the family name, and therefore, my educational trust was being entirely liquidated and absorbed back into the general estate. I had believed those words. I had let them define my worth as I froze on the sidewalks of the Upper East Side, picking up after other people's pets. Sitting in the secure data room at the Department of Justice 8 months ago, I finally pulled the original bank authorization forms regarding that trust. I matched them against the archival copies of my grandfather's actual signature. The loops were wrong. The pressure points on the terminal letters were entirely inconsistent. My grandfather had never signed that transfer. He had never disinherited me. Arthur and Evelyn had forged the document. They had enlisted Leona to help them liquidate the entire educational trust. I watched the cursor blink on my screen as I traced the routing numbers. The stolen capital did not go toward saving a bankrupt family estate. It was wired directly into an offshore holding account controlled by Marcus Thorne. My tuition money, my future, had been used as the initial seed capital to buy their way into Marcus's exclusive financial circle. The profound cruelty of it did not make me weep. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. Every blister I had earned walking those dogs, every night I had spent studying in a freezing apartment, was directly subsidizing the luxury vehicles Arthur and Evelyn parked in their driveway. They had not just stolen my money. They had deliberately destroyed my memory of the only man in our family who had ever genuinely loved me, simply to cover their tracks. I printed the wire transfer confirmations and placed them meticulously into a manila folder. I did not call them to demand an explanation. An explanation implies that there is a version of the story where their actions are somehow justifiable. There was no such version. I was going to let the federal penal code do the talking for me. I placed the forged letter next to the federal evidence. The paper trail was flawless. Exactly 2 weeks before the debutante gala, a battered cardboard box arrived at my apartment building. There was no return address on the shipping label. I opened it carefully on my kitchen counter. Inside rested my old canvas dog walking bag. The fabric was frayed and permanently stained with the salt and slush of New York winters. I hadn't seen it in years. I had left it in the coat closet of Arthur and Evelyn's house the day they threw me out. I reached inside the main compartment. My fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of heavy cardstock. I pulled it out and recognized the chaotic, hurried handwriting immediately. It belonged to Lily. Please do not believe the messages. The note read, Mom took my phone. She writes all of them. I am not allowed to leave the house. Do not text back. Check the blue ribbon inside the dress. For the past 12 months, I had received a steady stream of incredibly cruel text messages from Lily's number. They told me to stay away. They told me I was an embarrassment to the family and that she never wanted to see me again. I had respected those boundaries, believing my niece had simply absorbed the toxic ideology of her mother. I had stepped back, letting the silence grow between us. But the silence had been completely manufactured. Leona had orchestrated an elaborate psychological quarantine. She had confiscated Lily's devices, isolating her from the only person who possessed the legal knowledge and the independence to protect her. Lily was trapped inside a gilded cage, completely at the mercy of a mother who viewed her as nothing more than a highly valuable bargaining chip. I traced the edge of the frayed canvas bag. Lily was only 17 years old, yet she possessed the survival instincts of a seasoned operative. She knew the house staff would inspect any outgoing mail, so she used a relic of my past, a piece of garbage in Leona's eyes, to bypass their security. She was reaching out from the dark, asking me to be the shield I never had when I was her age. I folded the note and placed it securely inside my federal dossier. I would not fail her. The narrative, Arthur, Evelyn, and Leona projected to their social circle was one of tragic aristocratic decline. They loved to casually mention how the shifting economy had devastated their legacy. They claimed the $2.5 million they borrowed from Marcus Thorne was a desperate measure to keep the family home from entering foreclosure. It was a beautiful, sympathetic story, perfectly designed for the country club dining room. It was also a complete fabrication. When I subpoenaed their personal credit card statements and private banking ledgers, the actual anatomy of their debt was laid bare across my spreadsheets. The money did not go to property taxes or essential maintenance. It went to a luxury vacation villa in Aspen that they visited twice a year. It went to high-end jewelry auctions. It went to a fraudulent charitable foundation Leona established solely to secure invitations to exclusive metropolitan galas. They were burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars just to maintain the absolute illusion of relevance. And when the principal balance on the loan compounded beyond their ability to pay the minimum interest, they did not scale back their lifestyle. They did not sell the Aspen Villa or the jewelry. They decided to sell Lily. The engagement to Marcus was essentially a financial restructuring plan. In exchange for the teenager, Marcus would execute a quiet debt forgiveness protocol. I sat in the dim light of the federal records room, staring at the sheer audacity of their expenditures. They had convinced themselves that this transaction was a noble sacrifice for the greater good of the family name. Leona genuinely believed she was a loving mother securing a wealthy future for her daughter. This is the most dangerous kind of evil. It does not wear a mask of malice. It wears a costume of pragmatic necessity. They felt entitled to the money, and they felt entirely entitled to use Lily's autonomy as collateral to clear their own reckless ledgers. They were not victims of circumstance. They were architects of their own moral bankruptcy. I locked the spreadsheets and backed up the files to the secure server. Their illusion was entirely over. Marcus Thorne did not accidentally become the primary creditor to my family. He was a master of financial grooming. I spent weeks cross-referencing his corporate lending practices with the sealed bankruptcy filings of other prominent metropolitan families. A chilling, undeniable pattern emerged from the data. Marcus specifically targeted families with high social visibility and incredibly low liquid capital. He would approach them warmly, offering bridge loans with deceptively manageable introductory terms. He acted as the benevolent savior. But the contracts were meticulously rigged with floating interest rates and predatory default clauses. He waited patiently for the inevitable mathematical failure. When the families could no longer service the debt, he did not seize their properties. He seized their influence. I found the sealed testimonies of 3 other young women. They had all been ushered into sudden, highly secretive financial arrangements or hasty marriages with Marcus's immediate associates just days before their families were scheduled to face absolute financial ruin. Marcus was not in the business of real estate. He was in the business of human leverage. He acquired people. Lily was not a desperate, last-minute solution proposed by Leona. Lily was the original target. Marcus had structured the loan specifically to ensure my family would default exactly when my niece approached her 18th birthday. He had built the trap years in advance, watching her grow up, waiting for the asset to mature. The debutante gala was simply the stage setting for the final transfer of ownership. He required a public spectacle to legitimize the arrangement and to ensure that Leona and Arthur were entirely complicit in the eyes of their peers. Once the public engagement was announced, the social humiliation of backing out would effectively trap them forever. It was a flawless mechanism of coercion. I closed the final sealed testimony and locked my workstation. Marcus thought he was the smartest predator in the room because he used contracts instead of violence. He believed that if a crime was written in sophisticated legal jargon, it ceased to be a crime. He was about to receive a devastating education in federal anti-money laundering statutes. I knew his entire playbook. 3 days before the gala, I requested a formal, closed-door meeting with the regional director of the Department of Justice. I walked into his office, placed my badge on the center of his mahogany desk, and laid the comprehensive dossier right beside it. I did not sit down. I am formally declaring a severe conflict of interest, I stated, my voice completely level. The primary targets of this wire fraud and extortion investigation are my biological parents, my sister, and Marcus Thorne. The secondary victim is my minor niece. The director opened the file. He spent 20 minutes reading through the financial summaries, the forged trust documents, and the evidence of the predatory grooming network. The silence in the room was absolute. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. If I walked into that ballroom as the lead investigator, any competent defense attorney would immediately file a motion to dismiss the charges, citing personal vendetta and emotional bias. They would argue that I had weaponized the power of the federal government to settle a petty family dispute. I was not going to give them that escape hatch. I demanded that an independent tactical unit take over the operational execution of the arrest. I am recusing myself from the chain of command, I told him. I will not make the arrest. I will not sign the final warrant, but I know the building, I know the financial triggers, and I know exactly how they are going to execute the transfer. I am requesting to be assigned strictly as a frontline technical consultant." The director nodded slowly. He understood exactly what I was doing. By removing my authority, I was making the case absolutely bulletproof. I was building a fortress around the evidence that no amount of expensive legal maneuvering could ever breach. The operation was approved. A specialized team from the Financial Crimes Division would be in the building, posing as catering staff and security. I picked up my badge and slid it back into my pocket. I had sacrificed my ego to ensure their destruction was mathematically and legally guaranteed. The trap was now federal. 1 week before the gala, I arranged a highly classified meeting. I used a secure, untraceable prepaid phone to text Lily a time and an address. It was a veterinary clinic in Brooklyn, owned by a former classmate who owed me a favor. The scent of antiseptic and wet fur hung heavy in the air. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, opulent environments Marcus Thorne usually controlled. Lily arrived wearing an oversized hooded sweatshirt, trembling uncontrollably. She sat on a stainless steel examination table and finally broke down. She begged me to help her run away. She wanted to pack a bag, board a bus, and disappear into the Midwest. I handed her a tissue, but I did not offer her false comfort. I spoke to her with the precise, measured tone I use during federal interrogations. Running away was the absolute worst strategic move she could make. If she fled, Marcus would immediately trigger the default clauses. Evelyn and Arthur would lose the estate. Leona would face immediate financial ruin, and they would spend the rest of their lives hunting Lily down, blaming her for their absolute destruction. Marcus had vast resources. A runaway teenager would be located within 48 hours and forced back into the arrangement under even stricter isolation. We could not run from the contract. We had to detonate it from the inside. I explained the mechanics of federal wire fraud to a 17-year-old girl. I told her that Marcus needed her signature to legally transfer the trust, but the Department of Justice needed him to execute the digital debt forgiveness to finalize the criminal charge. I needed Lily to walk onto that stage. I needed her to wear the dress, stand under the chandelier, and play the role of the compliant, transactional bride. But I also gave her a weapon. I made her memorize a single, meticulously crafted sentence. It was designed to force Marcus and Leona to verbally confirm the illegal nature of the exchange on a recorded federal wire. Lily wiped her eyes, her posture slowly shifting from terrified prey to an active operative. She repeated the legal phrasing back to me until her delivery was entirely devoid of emotion. She memorized the exact words. Standing in the shadows of the service hallway at the penthouse, I watched the live security feed on my phone. The camera angle provided a clear view of the grand ballroom. Lily was standing near a towering display of white orchids. She was wearing a floor-length, custom-tailored silk engagement gown. It was breathtakingly beautiful, shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. To the hundreds of wealthy guests circulating the room, it looked like the pinnacle of high society elegance. To me, it looked exactly like a highly expensive, beautifully draped prison uniform. Leona stood firmly beside her daughter, her fingers gripping Lily's arm with a subtle, bruising intensity. Leona was wearing a diamond necklace that was undoubtedly funded by Marcus's initial predatory loan. She was smiling for the society photographers, playing the role of the overjoyed mother. She had completely stripped Lily of her autonomy, confiscating her phone, monitoring her emails, and surrounding her with private security. Leona believed she had neutralized every possible variable. She severely underestimated her daughter. I zoomed in on the hem of Lily's silk gown, around her waist, secured perfectly into the heavy fabric, was a thick blue ribbon. Leona thought it was simply a stylistic choice made by the designer. She had no idea what was actually stitched inside the lining of that ribbon. Lily had spent the last 3 days systematically gathering localized intelligence. Marcus was an arrogant man. Arrogant men often leave their home office doors unlocked when they believe the women in the house are entirely beneath their intellectual notice. Inside that blue ribbon, Lily had hidden a torn page from the original draft of the trust transfer. She had memorized and transcribed the digital access code to Marcus's primary wall safe. Furthermore, she had kept a meticulous, handwritten chronological log of every instance Leona had physically barred her from leaving the residence or accessing communication devices. It was a perfectly preserved chain of evidence, documenting severe psychological coercion and unlawful confinement. Every step Lily took across that marble floor was carrying the physical proof required to dismantle Marcus Thorne's empire. She was not just surviving the evening, she was actively facilitating a federal takedown. I watched her maintain a beautifully blank expression as a waiter handed her a glass of sparkling water. The silk was her armor. The digital clock on my screen shifted to exactly 9:45 in the evening. The preliminary social hour was drawing to a close. Soon, Marcus would call for the attention of the room, make his grand nauseating speech about family and legacy, and usher the primary players into his private study to execute the documents. The window for my physical entry was closing. I slipped my phone into my inner pocket and adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer. I pushed through the heavy, fire-rated door that separated the service corridors from the primary residence. The sensory transition was immediate and violently jarring. The faint smell of industrial bleach and cold concrete was instantly replaced by the overwhelming fragrance of expensive floral arrangements, roasted truffles, and imported perfume. The ambient hum of the building gave way to the sharp, overlapping chatter of Manhattan's financial elite and the smooth melodies of the string quartet. I stepped fully into the light of the grand foyer. No one noticed me at first. I was just another woman in a dark suit, blending effortlessly into the background of a highly orchestrated event. I walked slowly toward the edge of the main ballroom, maintaining a measured, deliberate pace. I did not scan the room nervously. A federal investigator never looks for targets. We let the targets reveal themselves through their own sudden anxiety. It took exactly 40 seconds for the illusion to crack. Leona was mid-sentence, laughing at a joke made by a prominent banking executive, when her eyes casually swept across the perimeter of the room. Her gaze locked onto mine. I saw the immediate, physiological reaction. The elegant smile froze, turning brittle and rigid. The color drained completely from her meticulously contoured face. Her hand tightened so violently around her champagne flute that I genuinely expected the crystal to shatter. She whispered something to Arthur, who was standing a few feet away. My former father turned his head. His reaction was slightly different. He did not look panicked. He looked deeply, furiously offended. He genuinely believed that his previous voice note had possessed the authority to banish me from the city. He believed his word was absolute law. He began marching toward me, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson, ready to quietly but forcefully eject the family disgrace. I stepped into the light. Before Arthur could reach me, a highly recognizable voice pierced the sophisticated murmur of the crowd. Well, if it isn't the girl from the service alley. I turned slightly. Standing a few feet away was Beatrice Sterling, an elderly socialite whose family controlled significant portions of the city's commercial real estate. She was dripping in emeralds and holding a martini glass like a weapon. 7 years ago, Beatrice owned a massive, highly aggressive Russian wolfhound. I was the girl they paid $15 an hour to walk it through the freezing rain because her actual staff refused to handle the animal. Beatrice looked me up and down, her eyes full of undisguised aristocratic contempt. She raised her voice, ensuring that the surrounding circle of wealthy guests, including Arthur and Leona, could hear every single word. I suppose anyone can rent a decent blazer these days. Tell me, do you still pick up animal waste for a living, or have you found a slightly more dignified way to beg for scraps? The immediate vicinity went dead silent. The string quartet continued playing, but the surrounding guests turned their attention to the spectacle. Leona halted her approach, a sudden cruel smile returning to her face. She was absolutely thrilled. She did not have to expel me herself. High society was doing the dirty work for her. Arthur crossed his arms, looking immensely satisfied. They wanted me to shrink. They wanted me to lower my head, flush with profound embarrassment, and retreat through the service doors where I belonged. I did not break eye contact with Beatrice. I did not frown. I offered her a perfectly polite, entirely serene smile. My heart rate remained at a steady 60 beats per minute. If you've ever stayed perfectly quiet while someone tried to humiliate you, knowing you held all the cards, let me know in the comments. When you hold federal jurisdiction over an entire room of corrupt individuals, insults sound exactly like ambient noise. I knew the concealed microphone beneath my lapel was recording the interaction perfectly in high definition. Beatrice thought she was verbally destroying me. She had no idea she was about to volunteer as a primary witness for the prosecution. I let her keep talking. I always told Evelyn that taking in a stray was a massive liability. Beatrice continued, her voice echoing in the quiet circle. She took a slow sip of her martini, clearly enjoying the captive audience. I remember it distinctly. It was January, 7 years ago. The exact same week Evelyn and Leona were busy securing their new financial portfolio at the offshore private branch on Fifth Avenue. I saw Leona there, meeting with Marcus. Such a busy, important week for the family. And there you were, dragging mud through my service lobby. My serene smile remained perfectly fixed, but internally, the forensic accountant inside me felt a profound surge of absolute triumph. Beatrice Sterling, in her desperate attempt to publicly humiliate me, had just handed the Department of Justice the ultimate missing puzzle piece. For months, Leona had maintained a solid legal defense, claiming she had absolutely no prior relationship with Marcus Thorne before the recent $2.5 million bridge loan. She claimed they only met a year ago under desperate circumstances. But Beatrice had just publicly testified, on a federally monitored audio recording, that she personally witnessed Leona executing offshore banking meetings with Marcus 7 years ago. She specifically anchored the timeline to the exact same week my educational trust was fraudulently liquidated and wired to the Cayman Islands. The alibi was completely destroyed. The narrative of the struggling, desperate mother vanished instantly. It established a 7-year timeline of premeditated financial collusion. Beatrice had unwittingly proven that Leona and Marcus were co-conspirators operating a long-term money laundering channel, fundamentally funded by my stolen tuition money. Arthur's face suddenly dropped. The satisfying smirk vanished from Leona's lips as her brain finally processed the catastrophic legal implications of what Beatrice had just loudly confirmed to a room full of people. She opened her mouth to interrupt the older woman, to desperately backtrack or change the subject. But the damage was permanently etched into the digital audio file. I finally spoke, my voice soft, smooth, and carrying the precise cadence of a courtroom cross-examination. Your memory is absolutely impeccable. Mrs. Sterling, January, 7 years ago, the offshore branch on Fifth Avenue. I sincerely appreciate your meticulous attention to chronological detail. Beatrice blinked, suddenly confused by my complete lack of humiliation. She didn't understand why the dog walker was thanking her, but Leona understood. Leona looked at me, and for the very first time in her entirely superficial life, she recognized the terrifying weight of absolute consequence. The insult became federal evidence. At exactly 11 o'clock, I stepped back from the edge of the dance floor and observed the glittering room. Many people might ask why I didn't simply walk up to the podium, flash my federal credentials, and pull my 17-year-old niece out of the building right then. To understand my hesitation, you must understand the precise, unforgiving mechanics of a white-collar prosecution. If I stopped the event prematurely, Marcus Thorne and Leona would merely look like wealthy individuals hosting an inappropriate, highly distasteful social gathering. Immorality is unfortunately not a federal offense. I needed a concrete, undeniable crime. The engagement itself was merely a smokescreen. You cannot legally bind a minor to a marital contract without severe regulatory scrutiny. Marcus knew this perfectly well. He did not care about a wedding ceremony. The debutante ball was designed to exert immense psychological pressure, forcing Lily to sign 3 specific documents in a private room. The first was a declaration of intent. The second was the appointment of a trust protector. The third was a prenuptial agreement designed to execute automatically the absolute second she turned 18. By signing those papers, Lily would unwittingly transfer the total controlling interest of her future financial assets directly into Marcus's corporate holding structure. In exchange, Marcus would electronically forgive the $2.5 million debt currently hanging over Leona and Arthur. But the intent to commit fraud is incredibly difficult to prove in front of a grand jury. High-priced defense attorneys can spin intent into a dozen different benign narratives. I needed absolute, digital execution. The crime of wire fraud requires a specific digital action transmitting data across state or international lines. The moment Marcus Thorne hit the button to clear the debt via his offshore servers, the trap would officially snap shut. If I intervened even 1 second before that wire transfer cleared the server, they would immediately claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding. They would shred the contracts and walk away completely free. I had to let the blade fall. I had to let them think they had won the game. I watched Leona adjust Lily's tiara, completely unaware of the federal surveillance capturing her every move. The clock kept moving forward. The digital display on my encrypted phone shifted to 11:15. The ballroom was reaching its crescendo of forced, manufactured celebration. Marcus Thorne had hired a professional videography team to document every interaction. The footage was intended to be an insurance policy, a visual record proving Lily's total, joyful compliance with the arrangement. I watched quietly from the perimeter as Leona physically steered her daughter toward a massive floral archway for another round of high-definition photographs. Lily looked utterly exhausted. The heavy silk of the gown seemed to be suffocating her, but she maintained the rigid, emotionless posture we had practiced. Every time Leona's grip tightened on her forearm, Lily simply stared straight ahead into the flashing bulbs. Arthur stood nearby, holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch, chatting amiably with a local politician. He looked entirely unbothered by the fact that he was actively brokering the financial sale of his own granddaughter. The legal contract Marcus had drafted stipulated a strict expiration protocol. If the documents were not fully executed by 11:59, the debt forgiveness offer would instantly vanish. Marcus would immediately trigger the default clauses, seizing my family's properties and liquidating their remaining assets by Monday morning. It was a brilliantly designed pressure cooker. Leona was terrified of losing her social standing, and Marcus was utilizing that terror to force the midnight signature. I did not intervene. I stood perfectly still near a marble pillar, analyzing the shifting dynamics of the room. My heart rate remained incredibly steady. In forensic investigations, premature action is the absolute enemy of justice. You cannot save the victim by alerting the predator to the trap. You have to let the predator open the cage and step inside completely of their own volition. I watched the second hand on my watch sweep slowly around the dial. I was waiting for the exact moment the music stopped. The final hour was approaching. At 11:30, a tall man in a tailored gray suit approached Marcus near the champagne tower. It was his primary corporate counsel, a lawyer named Gregory. Gregory had drafted the intricate labyrinth of trust transfers and the predatory loan agreements. He was the architect of the paperwork. He tapped his watch urgently, leaning in to whisper something directly into Marcus's ear. Marcus nodded slowly, a look of predatory anticipation crossing his features. To the untrained eye, Gregory looked like a loyal soldier ensuring his billionaire client's transaction went perfectly smoothly. Leona certainly believed he was on their side. She gave him a nervous, deeply grateful smile as he gestured toward the private study down the hall. But Leona was completely unaware of the actual dynamic unfolding. Gregory was not protecting Marcus Thorne. Gregory was currently acting as a confidential informant for the Department of Justice. 2 days ago, our task force had intercepted Gregory leaving his private country club. We sat him down in a windowless room and showed him the exact digital trail of Marcus's previous fraud schemes. We showed Gregory the internal communications indicating Marcus planned to use him as the primary legal scapegoat when the federal indictments inevitably came down. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. Gregory flipped immediately. He had spent the last 48 hours secretly logging document revisions and installing miniature recording devices in the private study. We were 15 minutes away from the wire transfer. Have you ever waited patiently for the exact moment karma was supposed to strike? Tell me below. Gregory was deliberately pushing the timeline. He was ensuring Marcus and Leona felt the absolute pressure of the midnight deadline, forcing them to make rushed, sloppy verbal admissions. I watched Gregory catch my eye for a fraction of a second across the crowded ballroom. He gave a microscopic, barely perceptible nod. The documents were ready on the desk. The audio feed was active. The final act was beginning. The players took their places. At exactly 11:45, Marcus placed a heavy hand on Lily's shoulder and guided her away from the crowded dance floor. Leona and Arthur followed closely behind, flanking the teenager like prison guards, ensuring an inmate reached the execution chamber. They moved down a quiet, heavily carpeted hallway toward Marcus's private VIP study. 2 large men in dark suits stood outside the heavy oak doors. They looked exactly like private security. They were actually undercover federal agents from my independent task force. I waited 30 seconds before detaching myself from the ballroom wall and following their exact path. The heavy bass of the orchestra faded into a muffled hum as I walked down the dim corridor. The 2 agents at the door recognized me immediately. They did not speak, but one of them subtly unlatched the heavy brass handle. I pushed the door open just as Gregory was laying 3 thick manila folders onto a large mahogany desk. I stepped inside the room and quietly pulled the heavy door shut behind me. I turned the brass deadbolt until it clicked loudly into place. The metallic sound echoed sharply in the sudden silence of the study. 5 heads snapped toward me. Marcus's eyes narrowed instantly, his predatory confidence faltering for a single, critical second. Leona gasped, her hand flying to her throat in genuine shock. Arthur's face flushed violently. He took a threatening step forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. He demanded to know how I had bypassed the security, screaming that I was trespassing and ordering me to leave the room immediately. He looked toward the door, fully expecting his guards to rush in and drag me away. I did not move. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. I simply looked at the closed door, then back to Arthur with a perfectly calm expression. No one was coming to help him. I clasped my hands loosely in front of me and leaned comfortably against the wood paneling. I told him I was perfectly fine exactly where I was. The room fell completely silent. Marcus Thorne was a man accustomed to absolute control. He quickly recovered his composure, adjusting his expensive silk tie and forcing a deeply patronizing smile. He looked at me with immense amusement, assuming I was simply a desperate, jealous aunt trying to stage a melodramatic family intervention. He turned his attention back to Lily, gesturing smoothly toward the gold fountain pen resting on the mahogany desk. He told her to ignore the interruption. He told her to tell her aunt how genuinely happy she was with this arrangement. Leona stepped closer to Lily, her voice a sharp, threatening hiss masked as maternal affection. She ordered Lily to sign the papers and prove that this was entirely consensual. This was the critical moment. If Lily cried, if she hesitated or begged for help, Marcus could easily claim she was simply overwhelmed by the wedding stress. I needed her to be precise. I needed her to establish the transactional nature of the crime on the federal recording. Lily did not cry. She took a slow, incredibly steady breath, her posture straightening in the heavy gown. She looked directly at Marcus, her dark eyes entirely devoid of fear. She did not reach for the pen. Instead, she delivered the exact sentence we had rehearsed in the Brooklyn Veterinary Clinic. I will only sign this document if you explicitly confirm, right now, that the $2.5 million debt holding my mother hostage is completely erased in writing tonight. The words hung in the air, sharp and absolutely devastating. It was not a romantic declaration. It was a sterile hostage negotiation. Marcus chuckled, completely failing to recognize the trap. He looked at Leona, then back to Lily, and confidently stated that yes, the debt would be electronically wiped the moment her signature hit the paper. Leona immediately chimed in, verbally confirming that this was the agreed-upon family solution. The audio recorders hidden in the room captured every single syllable perfectly. They had just confessed to extortion. The bait was completely taken. Lily picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. Her hand was miraculously steady. She leaned over the mahogany desk and signed her name on the designated line of the trust transfer document. She did not look at her mother. She pushed the folder across the polished wood toward Marcus. The physical action was complete, but the federal crime required the digital transmission. Marcus smiled, a look of ultimate triumph settling onto his weathered face. He pulled a sleek, encrypted tablet from his inner jacket pocket. He tapped a few keys, navigating directly to the secure portal of his offshore banking network. Gregory, standing quietly by the window, watched the screen intently. Marcus entered his biometric authorization and hit the final confirmation button. A soft, electronic chime echoed from the tablet. "It is done," Marcus announced smoothly. "The transfer is processing. Leona, your accounts are completely clear. Welcome to the family. Lily." Leona let out a dramatic sigh of profound relief, pressing her manicured hands to her face. Arthur clapped Marcus heavily on the shoulder. They were actively celebrating the successful sale of their own blood. I pushed myself off the wooden door and walked slowly toward the center of the room. I did not look angry. I felt an absolute, freezing calm settling into my bones. I stopped directly in front of the desk. I looked down at the signed papers, then up at the billionaire who truly thought he owned the world. I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that finally unsettled the men in the room. I politely thanked Mr. Thorne for his promptness. I told him that the digital confirmation of the wire transfer was the exact piece of evidence I was waiting for. The crime was no longer theoretical. The transaction had crossed international servers. The federal threshold was crossed. Marcus Thorne looked at me for a long, calculating moment. He did not panic. Men who have spent their entire lives operating above the law rarely recognize when the ground is collapsing beneath them. Instead of showing fear, he threw his head back and let out a loud, deeply patronizing laugh. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit, retrieved a secondary mobile device, and pressed a single speed dial button. He spoke exactly 4 words into the receiver. "We have a problem." Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the study swung open. A man with silver hair and a deeply expensive overcoat walked into the room. I recognized him immediately. He was a highly influential regional director from a completely different branch of the federal government, a man known to attend Marcus's exclusive charity galas. Marcus smiled, gesturing toward me with an elegant wave of his hand as if I were a minor, annoying pest that needed to be swatted away by the exterminator. The regional director did not ask for my side of the story. He looked at me with an expression of absolute disgust. He loudly declared that my presence in this room was a gross, unforgivable abuse of federal resources to settle a petty domestic dispute. He stated that he had already made a call to the Internal Affairs Division. Effective immediately, I was officially stripped of my investigative authority, suspended without pay, and ordered to surrender my credentials and any confidential files in my possession. Arthur and Evelyn practically exhaled with profound relief. Leona's smile returned, wider and more venomous than before. She stepped forward, crossing her arms, looking at me as if I were back in the freezing alleyway holding dog leashes. Marcus walked slowly around the mahogany desk. He did not ask for the thick manila folder I was holding. He simply ripped it out of my hands. He walked over to the decorative gas fireplace burning brightly in the corner of the study. Without a second of hesitation, he tossed the entire investigative file into the open flames. He watched the paper curl and blacken, turning to ash. He looked back at me, his eyes gleaming with the arrogant certainty of a predator who had just effortlessly defeated his prey. He told me to leave his building before he had me arrested for trespassing. I did not move. I reached into my pocket, slowly retrieved my federal badge, and placed it gently on the edge of the mahogany desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with the corrupt regional director or demand justice. I simply smoothed the lapels of my blazer and looked directly at Marcus Thorne, who was still admiring the ashes of the burned folder in the fireplace. "You are absolutely correct about the suspension," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy silence of the room. "However, the administrative action is entirely meaningless. As I documented weeks ago, I formally recused myself from the operational chain of command on this specific case. I am not the arresting officer. I am merely a technical consultant." Marcus frowned, his arrogant smile faltering slightly as he tried to process the legal distinction. I gestured toward the fireplace. "Furthermore," I continued, maintaining perfect eye contact, "the folder you just deliberately incinerated did not contain the original evidentiary documents. It was a decoy file, intentionally marked with localized tracking codes. The actual, digitally encrypted federal dossier was securely transmitted directly to the Department of Justice servers 45 minutes ago. By destroying that physical copy in front of multiple witnesses, you have successfully added the felony charge of destruction of federal evidence to your impending indictment." The corrupt regional director's face lost all its color. He instinctively took a step backward, suddenly realizing he had walked into a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. He reached for his phone, but before he could dial a single number, the situation rapidly escalated. The 2 massive men standing guard outside the study doors, the ones Arthur assumed were private security, stepped inside the room. They pulled back their suit jackets, revealing the stark yellow letters of the Federal Bureau on their tactical vests. In the hallway beyond, the sound of the string quartet abruptly stopped. replaced by the heavy, synchronized footsteps of an independent tactical unit moving rapidly through the penthouse. "Mr. Thorne," one of the undercover agents announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, extortion, and money laundering." Marcus froze, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit that did not exist. Leona let out a sharp, genuine scream of absolute terror as an agent approached her with heavy steel restraints. The fortress of wealth and privilege they had built around themselves was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The trap finally closed. The transition from high society elegance to a federal crime scene is remarkably swift. The flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles illuminated the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. Marcus Thorne was read his rights and escorted out the door in total silence. He finally understood that his money could not purchase an exemption from a flawlessly executed paper trail. Arthur and Evelyn were shaking uncontrollably. As an agent moved to secure their wrists, Evelyn turned to me, tears streaming down her carefully preserved face. She played the only card she knew how to play: the victim. She begged me to intervene. She cried out that they had no idea what Marcus was truly planning, that they were simply desperate parents trying to survive a financial crisis. She pleaded with me to tell the independent prosecutor that they were manipulated and entirely innocent of the extortion charges. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. It was a certified bank statement from an offshore account. I unfolded it slowly and handed it directly to the federal agent standing beside my former father. "I cannot do that," I told Evelyn, my voice perfectly level, "because this statement clearly details a secret and secondary transfer of $100,000 wired directly from Marcus Thorne's holding company to a private account in your name. It was coded as a consulting fee, disbursed specifically to guarantee that you would force Lily to sign the documents tonight." Leona, who was standing nearby in handcuffs, whipped her head around to look at her parents. Her expression shifted from terror to pure, unfiltered rage. She had been willing to sell her daughter to maintain her own lifestyle, but she had absolutely no idea that Arthur and Evelyn had secretly negotiated a private commission for themselves behind her back. "You took a cut," Leona screamed at her mother, completely abandoning her refined aristocratic persona. "You sold my daughter for a side payment." Arthur began yelling back, trying to justify the secret funds as necessary retirement protection. The illusion of their unified, loving family completely disintegrated right in front of me. They were not bound by loyalty or affection. They were only ever bound by mutual greed. As the agents physically separated them and led them out of the study, they continued to scream vicious accusations at one another, doing the prosecutor's job for him. They destroyed themselves. The room was finally quiet. The only people remaining in the private study were myself, a federal victim advocate, and Lily. The teenager was sitting on the edge of the leather sofa, still wearing the heavy silk engagement gown. The adrenaline that had carried her through the terrifying performance was rapidly fading, replaced by the profound weight of the psychological aftermath. I walked over and sat down carefully in the armchair across from her. She did not look at me with immediate gratitude. She did not throw her arms around me and thank me for rescuing her from a nightmare. Instead, she looked up, her dark eyes filled with a complicated, painful mixture of relief and deep betrayal. "You knew," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You found the banking records 8 months ago. You knew exactly what they were planning to do to me. Why did you wait until tonight? You used me as bait." It was the hardest question of the entire investigation, and it deserved the absolute truth. I did not try to soften the reality with comforting platitudes. I looked directly into her eyes and nodded slowly. If I had pulled you out of this house 8 months ago, I explained quietly, Marcus would have legally shredded the evidence. Your mother would have claimed it was a misunderstanding. They would have walked away completely free, and Marcus would have simply moved on to destroy another vulnerable family. I needed the wire transferred across the server. I needed the crime to be undeniable. I had to let you stand in the fire so I could permanently burn their empire to the ground. A single tear slipped down Lily's cheek, ruining her perfect, professionally applied makeup. She was safe, but she was simultaneously processing the horrific realization that the adults in her life, even the one who had ultimately saved her, had been forced to calculate her trauma as an operational variable. I did not ask for her forgiveness. True protection is rarely warm, and it is almost never entirely innocent. Sometimes, protecting the vulnerable requires executing decisions that are fundamentally cold. I told her that I was sorry she had to carry the weight of that strategy, but I would never apologize for ensuring that the people who tried to sell her would spend the rest of their natural lives in a federal penitentiary. The truth is heavy. 6 months later, the seasonal winds sweeping through New York were warm and full of life. The federal indictments had effectively dismantled the Thorn financial network. Marcus was currently serving a 30-year sentence in a maximum security facility without the possibility of early parole. Leona, Arthur, and Evelyn had turned on each other during the preliminary hearings, accepting plea deals that still guaranteed them significant time behind bars. The aristocratic facade they had killed for was utterly eradicated. I stood in the immaculate marble lobby of the family court building downtown. The judge had just officially granted me full, uncontested legal guardianship of Lily. She was no longer a bargaining chip. She was a free citizen. During the asset forfeiture phase of the federal trial, the prosecution successfully recovered the original funds that had been stolen from my grandfather's educational trust. The government offered to return the money directly to my personal accounts with accumulated interest. I formally declined the disbursement. I did not want a single dollar that had passed through their contaminated system. Instead, I worked with the DOJ to establish a completely independent, impenetrable charitable trust. The funds were specifically designated to support legal advocacy and emergency housing for teenagers attempting to escape financial abuse and coercive family dynamics. I named Lily as the sole, irrevocable director of the foundation, ensuring that no one could ever use money to manipulate her autonomy again. She now held absolute control over the legacy our family had tried to steal. We walked toward the exit of the courthouse together. 7 years ago, I had been forced to navigate this city through service elevators and garbage alleys, terrified of being seen by the people who had discarded me. Today, I did not look for the side exit. I placed my hand gently on my niece's shoulder, and together, we pushed open the massive, heavy glass doors at the front of the building. We stepped out onto the wide, sunlit avenue, the noise of the city washing over us. We didn't need to hide anymore. The ledger was finally, permanently balanced, and the debts of the past had been completely erased by the truth. We walked straight ahead. It was a brilliant Saturday morning in Central Park. The air was crisp, and the pathways were crowded with people enjoying the early sunshine. Lily and I were walking along the reservoir. We were not managing a pack of aggressive, purebred show dogs for demanding billionaires. We were walking a small, slightly nervous rescue terrier mix that Lily had adopted from a local shelter 3 weeks ago. Lily looked remarkably different. The heavy burden of forced perfection had vanished from her posture. She was wearing comfortable jeans and a simple sweater, holding a cup of coffee and talking enthusiastically about her upcoming university applications. She had completely abandoned the idea of pursuing corporate law or business administration, the paths Leona had aggressively demanded. Instead, Lily was applying to programs focused on adolescent psychology and social advocacy. She wanted to build a career teaching other vulnerable kids how to identify and break free from systemic manipulation. I watched her throw a tennis ball for the terrier, feeling a profound, quiet peace settle in my chest. We were not fully healed. Healing from that level of profound betrayal requires years of deliberate, careful work. But we were definitively safe. Society constantly pushes the narrative that family is an unbreakable, sacred bond. We are taught to endure endless toxicity under the guise of unconditional loyalty. But the reality I learned in the freezing snow and the reality I proved in a federal courtroom is fundamentally different. Bloodlines do not grant anyone immunity to cruelty. Sharing a last name does not give someone the right to treat your life as a disposable asset on a balance sheet. Sometimes, the truest, most profound act of family love is tearing the family apart to protect the innocent. I had spent my entire youth believing I was the broken one because I could not afford their affection. It cost me everything to learn that my worth was never something they had the currency to buy. If you believe that breaking a toxic cycle is the ultimate form of love, share this story. It might just give someone the courage they need to walk out their own front door. Subscribe to Calm Drama Stories and never let anyone tell you what you're worth. We kept walking forward.